I'm going to find something better. Those 7 words, delivered through a cold voicemail while I stood scanning groceries at Parker's Market, didn't just end my marriage. They ended the woman I thought I was. My hands are still shaking as I tell you this. Today, I'm going to share something I never thought I'd have the courage to tell. And if you, for even 1 second, feel like this story sounds familiar, I just ask that you leave a like and subscribe, because this story might help someone draw closer to God's love. Amen. My name is Rebecca Morrison, but everyone calls me Becky. I'm 41 years old, and for the past 18 years, I've worked the same checkout lane at Parker's Market in downtown Phoenix, Arizona. Every morning at 6 a.m., I'd slip on that faded red polyester vest, pin my name tag to my chest, and smile at customers who saw me as nothing more than a necessary step between them and their dinner plans. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting their harsh white glow across endless streams of people who had places to go and lives to live. My wedding ring would catch that light as I reached for each item, a simple gold band that once meant forever, but had started feeling more like a chain binding me to promises that apparently only I intended to keep. That Tuesday afternoon felt like any other. The woman in front of me struggled with 2 screaming toddlers, their red faces twisted with the particular fury that comes from being dragged through adult errands. I offered her a sympathetic smile, the same smile I'd perfected after 18 years of customer service, when every human emotion had to be filtered through professional courtesy. My earbuds sat snugly in my ears, a small rebellion against corporate policy. Most managers looked the other way as long as I stayed efficient and pleasant. The music usually helped the hours pass, provided a soundtrack that made each shift feel less like a prison sentence and more like meditation. But today, instead of music, my phone delivered a message that would shatter my world into irreparable pieces. I'm going to find something better. Ryan's voice carried through the wireless signal with devastating clarity. Each word was precisely enunciated in the tone he used for business matters. Cold, calculated, final. I need someone who matches my future. I'm going to find something better. Not even the courtesy of a face-to-face conversation. Not even waiting until I came home from work. A voicemail, delivered while I stood in my workplace, surrounded by strangers, wearing the uniform that had become my second skin. My hand froze mid-scan, the barcode reader trembling in my fingers. The red laser swept back and forth across a milk carton, searching for the pattern that would translate into a price, but my fingers had gone numb. The fluorescent lights seemed to grow brighter, more harsh, buzzing like a swarm of insects in my ears. I rewound the message once. Surely I'd misheard. Surely Ryan, who could be thoughtless but had never been deliberately cruel, hadn't actually ended our 12-year marriage via voicemail. But the replay confirmed every devastating word. I tried again, then a third time, hoping the recording would somehow change, that reality would reassert itself. But each repetition only drove the brutal truth deeper. The man I'd loved, supported, and sacrificed for had discarded me with the same casual indifference he might show deleting unwanted emails. The line behind me grew restless. A businessman in an expensive suit checked his Rolex with the impatient gesture of someone whose time was more valuable than my crisis. A teenager with purple hair tapped her foot, eyes fixed on her phone screen. An elderly woman clutched her purse with arthritic fingers, wearing the patient resignation of someone who'd learned that complaining only made delays feel longer. Life marched forward while my universe collapsed inward, creating a black hole of pain right there in aisle 7, between breakfast cereals and cleaning supplies, where the industrial carpet bore stains from countless spilled drinks and the fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song. Something cracked wide open in my chest. Not clean like glass breaking, but messy and raw, like old wood splintering under too much weight. I'd been carrying that weight for years without realizing it, and now the entire architecture of my life was giving way at once. "Ma'am?" The businessman's voice carried the particular irritation reserved for service workers who dared experience human emotions during business hours. "Is there a problem?" I looked up at this stranger whose biggest concern was whether grocery shopping would make him late for whatever important meeting awaited him. I wanted to explain that my husband had just abandoned me via voicemail, that 12 years of marriage had been dismissed in 30 seconds of recorded audio, that I was discovering the exact moment when everything I'd believed about my life revealed itself to be a lie. Instead, I managed a weak smile and resumed scanning his items: organic vegetables that cost more than I spent on food in a week, imported cheese worth half my daily wage, wine I'd never be able to afford even for special occasions. Each beep felt like a small death, another reminder of the vast gulf between my circumstances and those of the people I served. The rest of my shift passed in a mechanical haze. I scanned barcodes, counted change, bagged groceries, and wished customers pleasant days while my mind replayed Ryan's message on endless loop. The words became a mantra of rejection accompanying every mundane task. I'm going to find something better. Beep. Another can of soup for someone else's dinner. I need someone who matches my future. Beep. Another bottle of wine for someone else's celebration. The drive home took me past landmarks that now felt contaminated. The coffee shop where Ryan and I had our first date, nervously sharing chocolate cake. The park where we'd walked our dog Max on Sunday mornings. The restaurant where he'd proposed 7 years ago, getting down on one knee beside a table decorated with roses. Each memory felt poisoned by the knowledge that while I'd been treasuring these moments as evidence of our love's permanence, Ryan had apparently been cataloging my inadequacies and planning his escape. How long had he been thinking about leaving? How many conversations had been his way of gathering ammunition for eventual divorce proceedings? I'd grown up in a working-class family that believed in persistence, in the idea that good things came to those who worked hard and waited patiently. My mother had drilled into me the virtues of loyalty and commitment. Marriage isn't about finding someone perfect, she'd say while folding laundry in our small kitchen. It's about choosing someone and working together to build something beautiful. I'd carried those lessons into my relationship with Ryan, enduring his complaints about our modest lifestyle, his pointed comments about my appearance that always began with, "I'm not trying to be mean, but," his growing obsession with status, the way he'd introduce me to colleagues that somehow emphasized my grocery store job while downplaying my equal contribution to our household. Ryan worked in finance, a fact he mentioned with the regularity of someone checking their pulse. His salary exceeded mine, a disparity he referenced almost daily, not with pride, but with weary disappointment, as if my inability to match his earnings was a personal failing rather than economic reality. Despite earning significantly more, Ryan never shared his financial success in ways that might have improved our joint circumstances. "You've got your paycheck," he'd say whenever I suggested pooling resources for a vacation or home improvement. "Use that." And I had, stretching my grocery store wages to cover half the bills, all the food shopping, whatever household needs arose outside Ryan's definition of his responsibilities. I'd learned creativity with coupons and sales, planning meals around marked-down proteins, repairing instead of replacing. I'd even contributed to our house's down payment, dipping into savings accumulated since my 20th birthday, money saved quarter by quarter during lean years when every dollar mattered. That contribution had been presented as romantic gesture, symbol of partnership. Now I realized it had simply been another way for Ryan to leverage my resources while maintaining complete control over his own. The house stood silent when I arrived, but it was a different silence than I'd grown accustomed to. This wasn't the quiet of an empty home waiting to be filled with conversation and laughter. This was the hollowness of a space deliberately emptied, systematically stripped of everything that made it feel like home rather than just a building. The moment I stepped inside, I knew something fundamental had changed. The air felt thinner, as if someone had opened all the windows and let the essence of our shared life escape into the atmosphere. The leather sectional we'd saved for over 2 years, gone. I could see the indentations in the carpet where its legs had rested, small depressions marking the ghost of furniture we'd chosen together during a weekend shopping trip that had felt like such an adult milestone. The dining room set my parents had given us as a wedding gift vanished completely. Even the coffee table I'd refinished myself during a long weekend project had disappeared. I'd spent hours sanding away years of wear, revealing beautiful wood grain beneath layers of neglect. When I'd applied the final coat of polyurethane and stepped back to admire my work, Ryan had nodded and said it looked almost professional. Almost. Even my accomplishments came with qualifiers in his world. But it wasn't just the missing furniture that told the story of my systematic erasure. It was the pale rectangles on the walls where our photographs had hung. Pictures from our honeymoon in Sedona, framed prints we'd bought at the Phoenix Art Fair, even the silly snapshot of us at a Halloween party when we'd dressed as matching playing cards. These ghostly marks served as an inventory of shared memories that had apparently meant more to me than to him. Standing in that hollow shell of what had been our home, I found myself remembering the woman I'd been before Ryan, before I'd learned to apologize for taking up space, before I'd started measuring my worth by his approval, before I'd allowed my voice to shrink to accommodate his growing need for control. I'd been Rebecca Ann Patterson then, daughter of a mechanic and a seamstress who'd raised me in a small Baptist church on the outskirts of Tucson. Every Sunday morning, Mama would press my dress with starch so heavy it could stand on its own, and Daddy would polish his one good pair of shoes until they reflected the Arizona sun. We didn't have much, but we had faith, and we had each other. And somehow that had felt like enough. "Becky," Mama used to say while we sat shelling peas on the front porch, "the Lord sees every sacrifice you make, even when nobody else notices. Especially when nobody else notices." She'd pause in her work, looking out at the desert landscape that stretched toward mountains painted purple by distance. "You remember that when life gets hard. God keeps better records than people do." I'd carried those words with me through high school, through community college where I'd studied business administration with dreams of maybe opening my own store someday, through the early years of working retail while other girls my age were getting married and starting families. I'd been patient, believing that God had a plan, that the right person would come along when the time was right. And then Ryan had walked into the electronics store where I was working, needing help choosing a laptop for his new job at the investment firm. He was 28 to my 26, well-dressed in a way that suggested success without arrogance, polite to the point where other customers noticed. When he'd asked if I'd like to get coffee sometime, I'd felt something shift in my chest. A recognition, maybe, or just relief that someone who seemed to have his life together had noticed me. Our courtship had been traditional, respectful. Ryan would pick me up for dates in his clean sedan, always arriving exactly on time, always opening doors, always insisting on paying even when I offered to split the check. He'd listen when I talked about wanting to use my business degree someday, nodding thoughtfully as if my dreams were worth his consideration. "You're different," he'd said one evening as we walked around Tempe Town Lake, the city lights reflecting off the water like fallen stars. "Most women I meet are so demanding, focused on what they can get rather than what they can give. But you understand that relationships are about partnership, about building something together." I'd felt chosen, blessed even. Here was a man who appreciated my willingness to put others first, who saw my servant's heart as a virtue rather than a weakness. When he'd proposed, 18 months later, kneeling beside that restaurant table decorated with roses he'd somehow arranged in advance, I'd said yes, not just to marriage, but to the vision of partnership he'd painted with his words. The early years had been good, or at least, they'd felt good at the time. We'd pooled our resources to buy the little house in Phoenix, and I'd thrown myself into making it a home with the same dedication I'd once reserved for my career ambitions. I'd learned to cook Ryan's favorite meals, decorated according to his preferences, managed our social calendar around his work schedule and professional obligations. When his mother had fallen ill during our 3rd year of marriage, I'd been the one who'd driven to Flagstaff every weekend to check on her, bringing groceries and cleaning her house while Ryan worked overtime to secure the promotion he'd been chasing. When she'd needed surgery, I'd used my vacation days to stay with her during recovery, sleeping on her uncomfortable couch and managing her medications while Ryan sent flowers and called once a day from the office. "I don't know what we would have done without you," his mother had whispered from her hospital bed, her hand squeezing mine with surprising strength. "Ryan chose well. You're the daughter I always prayed for." Those words had filled me with such warmth, such certainty that I was living out God's plan for my life. This was what Christian marriage looked like: sacrifice, service, putting family needs above personal desires. This was how you built something lasting, something worthy of the vows we'd spoken before God and witnesses. But somehow, over the years, My sacrifices had become expectations rather than gifts. The weekend trips to care for his mother became my responsibility alone. The holiday preparations, the gift buying, the relationship maintenance with his extended family, all of it gradually shifted to my shoulders while Ryan focused on advancing his career. "You're so much better at this stuff than I am," he'd say, when I'd suggest he call his aunt on her birthday, or remember to send a graduation card to his cousin. "People respond to you. You have that gift for making others feel special." And I'd believed him, had seen it as confirmation of my purpose. God had given me these abilities, the gift of service, of remembering details, of caring for others. And Ryan was simply recognizing what the Lord had already revealed. It felt holy, even when it felt exhausting. When Ryan's career had hit a rough patch 5 years into our marriage, when his expected promotion had gone to someone else, and he'd spent months bitter and withdrawn, I'd been the one to maintain hope for both of us. I'd picked up extra shifts at work, had stretched our budget to cover the expensive suits and networking events he insisted were necessary for professional advancement, had listened to hours of complaints about unfair treatment and office politics. "I just need you to believe in me," he'd said during one of those long, dark conversations that stretched past midnight. "Everyone else sees limitations, but you see potential. That's what I need right now. Someone who sees what I could become, not just what I am." So I'd believed. I'd prayed daily for Ryan's success, had fasted during his job interviews, had filled our conversations with encouragement, even when his self-pity threatened to drown us both. When the promotion had finally come through, when he'd started earning the salary he'd always felt he deserved, I'd celebrated his victory as if it were my own. But success had changed him, or maybe it had simply revealed parts of his character that had been hidden during leaner times. The man who'd once appreciated my frugality began criticizing my appearance, suggesting that a more expensive haircut might be appropriate for someone married to a financial advisor. The husband who'd praised my cooking started making pointed comments about restaurants his colleagues frequented, places where serious business got done over meals I couldn't afford to recreate at home. "Image matters in my field," he'd explain when I'd question the necessity of yet another expensive purchase. The luxury watch, the premium gym membership, the car lease that cost more than my monthly salary. "People need to trust that I know how to manage money because they can see I know how to make it." Meanwhile, my own contributions to our household had become invisible, unremarkable. The fact that I'd continued working full-time while managing all domestic responsibilities seemed to count for nothing against his growing income. The evening meals I prepared, the laundry I folded, the bills I organized and tracked, all of it was simply expected, background support for the important work he did in the world. When I'd suggested, tentatively, that maybe it was time for me to use my business degree, maybe explore opportunities that might lead to something more than retail management, Ryan's response had been swift and cutting. "Becky, be realistic. You've been out of school for 15 years. The business world has changed. Besides, we don't need the disruption right now. I'm at a crucial point in my career and I need stability at home, not another source of stress." Another source of stress. As if my dreams were inconveniences, burdens he shouldn't have to bear on top of his own ambitions. So I'd stayed at Parker's Market, had accepted each small promotion with gratitude instead of the disappointment that lived quietly in my chest. I'd convinced myself that this was temporary, that once Ryan felt more secure in his success, once we'd paid down more of the mortgage, once life settled into a more comfortable rhythm, we'd revisit my aspirations. But later, kept receding like a mirage, always just out of reach, always conditional on circumstances that never quite aligned with my needs. Standing in our emptied bedroom, staring at Ryan's vacant closet, I felt the full weight of those accumulated years of deferred dreams. The wooden hangers swayed slightly in the air conditioning current, like remnants of a forest after wildfire had consumed everything combustible. My own clothes looked lost and lonely on their side of the shared space, a visual representation of how I'd felt for months without consciously acknowledging it. Even Max was gone. Our golden retriever, who'd been my constant companion through long shifts and difficult days, who'd greeted me at the door every evening with unconditional enthusiasm that made minimum wage work bearable, had been taken along with everything else Ryan had decided belonged to him. I found Max's leash hanging on the kitchen hook, red nylon with reflective stitching, chosen for evening walks when visibility mattered for safety. Max had learned to recognize the sound of me taking it down, the small metallic clink that meant adventure was imminent. He'd dance around my feet while I attached it to his collar, his joy so pure it never failed to lift my spirits even on the worst days. Now the leash hung limp and purposeless, a reminder of companionship that had been severed as cleanly as everything else in my life. Ryan had taken Max not because he particularly enjoyed dog ownership. I'd been the one who fed, walked, and cared for him, but because Max was an asset with monetary value, something that could be claimed and removed from my reach. That night, sitting on the bare mattress Ryan had deemed unworthy of theft, I reached for the Bible my mother had given me on my wedding day. Its leather cover was soft with years of handling, pages marked with underlined verses and margin notes in my careful handwriting. This book had been my anchor through every storm, my source of comfort when human wisdom fell short. But as I opened to the familiar psalms that had always brought peace, the words seemed to mock my situation. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart," I read, "and lean not on your own understanding." But what did trust look like when the person you'd trusted most had betrayed you so completely? How did you lean on God's understanding when your own had proven so catastrophically flawed? "Lord," I whispered into the darkness of my hollow house, "I've tried to be the wife you wanted me to be. I've served, I've sacrificed, I've forgiven, but I'm drowning here, and I don't know how to save myself." The silence that followed felt heavier than any answer. 2 days after Ryan's departure, when I'd begun to adjust to the hollow echo of my own footsteps in a house designed for 2 people, the phone rang with news that sent my world spinning further into chaos. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and utterly without sympathy. A bank representative calling about the mortgage payment that was apparently now 3 months overdue. "Mrs. Morrison, this is Jennifer Walsh from First National Bank," the woman said, her tone suggesting this was merely another item to check off her daily list of unpleasant conversations. "We've been trying to reach you regarding your mortgage account. According to our records, payment stopped in January, and we need to discuss your options immediately." I stared at the phone, certain there had been some mistake. Ryan handled our finances with methodical precision, managing accounts and investments while I focused on what he called the day-to-day stuff. I'd trusted him completely, never questioning the division of labor that left me responsible for groceries and utilities while he managed our long-term financial security. "There must be some confusion," I said, my voice sounding foreign, higher and more desperate than I'd intended. "My husband handles our mortgage payments. He sets up automatic transfers every month. According to our records, Mr. Morrison contacted us 3 months ago to remove his automatic payment authorization," Jennifer Walsh continued, her voice neutral, but somehow conveying implied criticism. "He indicated that you would be taking over responsibility for the account going forward." The words hit me like physical blows. Ryan had been planning his departure for months, systematically removing himself from our financial obligations while allowing me to remain ignorant of the approaching disaster. What kind of wife didn't know her own husband had stopped paying their mortgage? What kind of adult allowed someone else to manage such fundamental aspects of their financial life without any oversight? "The amount due, including late fees and penalties, is $18,437, she continued. "We'll need to see some kind of payment within the next 10 days, or we'll have no choice but to begin foreclosure proceedings." $18,000. More than my entire annual salary after taxes. The number hung in the air like a mathematical impossibility, a figure so far beyond my means, it might as well have been 18 million. I could work every available shift at Parker's Market for the next 2 years and still not accumulate enough money to satisfy this debt. After hanging up, I sat in my empty kitchen trying to calculate whether survival was even possible under any conceivable circumstances. If I could find another job immediately, if I could work 80 hours a week, if I could eliminate every expense beyond basic survival, even then, the mathematics of poverty made the bank's demands impossible to satisfy. That Sunday, I drove to Calvary Baptist Church where I'd been attending sporadically since moving to Phoenix. The small congregation met in a converted strip mall between a nail salon and a tax preparation office. Nothing like the grand stone sanctuary of my childhood church in Tucson. But Pastor Williams had kind eyes and a gentle voice, and his sermons focused on God's love rather than judgment. Exactly what I'd needed during the difficult years of my marriage. I slipped into a back pew just as the service began, hoping to find some peace in familiar hymns and comforting scripture. The sanctuary was maybe half full, mostly older couples and a few families with small children. These were working people like me, folks who understood struggle, who came to church seeking strength for another week of making ends meet and holding families together. "Friends," Pastor Williams began, his voice carrying easily through the modest space, "I want to talk today about the silence of God. Not because God is absent, but because sometimes his voice gets drowned out by the noise of our circumstances." I felt my chest tighten. Was he speaking directly to me? Could he see the desperation I was trying so hard to hide? Scripture tells us in Isaiah 55:8, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord." Pastor Williams walked among the pews as he spoke, making eye contact with various congregants. "Sometimes we pray and heaven seems silent. We wonder if God is listening, if he cares, if our suffering matters to him at all." Around me, heads nodded in recognition. These people knew what it meant to cry out to God from the depths of despair, to wait for answers that seemed never to come. Mrs. Chen, who'd lost her husband to cancer last year, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Mr. Rodriguez, who'd been laid off from the construction company after 30 years, stared at his hands folded in his lap. "But friends," the pastor continued, his voice growing stronger, "silence doesn't mean absence. Sometimes God is working in ways we can't see, preparing miracles we can't imagine. Sometimes the waiting is part of the blessing." After the service, I lingered in the parking lot, not ready to return to my empty house. Mrs. Chen approached me, her small frame bundled in a cardigan despite the Arizona heat. "You look troubled, dear," she said, her accent thick but her English clear. "I see that look, like the world is pressing down on your shoulders." I tried to smile, to maintain the pretense that everything was fine. "Just going through a difficult time, Mrs. Chen. Nothing that prayer can't handle." She studied my face with the wisdom of someone who'd survived her own share of heartbreak. "Prayer is good, but sometimes God sends help through people, not just through heaven. You remember that." She pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand before walking away. Inside was her phone number and a simple message: "Call if you need anything. No questions asked. Grace Chen." That small gesture of kindness broke something loose inside me. Here was a woman who barely knew me, who was dealing with her own grief, offering help with no strings attached. When had anyone in my own family, even my husband, shown such simple compassion? The week that followed brought a series of small humiliations that chipped away at what remained of my dignity. At Parker's Market, customers seemed more impatient than usual, complaining about wait times and prices as if I personally controlled the store's policies. One woman, exasperated by a price check delay, looked me up and down with obvious disdain. "Don't you people get any training? How hard is it to scan a barcode?" "You people," as if my red vest marked me as a different species, unworthy of basic courtesy. I maintained my professional smile while something inside me withered a little more. During my lunch break, I called every rental office in Phoenix, hoping to find something, anything, I could afford on my salary. The conversations followed the same pattern, promising descriptions over the phone, followed by awkward silence when I disclosed my income. "I'm sorry," said the fourth apartment manager that day, "but our income requirements are 3 times the monthly rent. You'd need to earn at least $3,600 a month to qualify for our smallest unit." $3,600. I made barely half that amount, and that was before taxes. The American dream of home ownership had become an impossible fantasy, but apparently even basic shelter was now beyond my reach. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of bills, trying to perform mathematical miracles. Rent anywhere decent would consume my entire paycheck. Utilities, food, transportation, basic necessities, none of it added up to survival, let alone dignity. I opened my Bible to Philippians 4:19, a verse I'd memorized as a child. And my God will meet all your needs according to the riches of his glory in Christ Jesus. But sitting there surrounded by unpayable bills and impossible choices, those words felt like mockery rather than comfort. Lord, I whispered, I need you to be more than words on a page right now. I need you to be real, to be present, to show me how to survive this. The silence that followed felt absolute. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Becky, this is Pastor Williams. Mrs. Chen mentioned you might be going through a difficult time. Our church has a food pantry and emergency assistance fund. No questions asked, no obligations. Can you stop by tomorrow? I stared at the message, torn between gratitude and shame. Accepting charity felt like admitting defeat, like confirming that I'd failed at the basic adult task of taking care of myself. But pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. The next morning, I arrived at the church to find Pastor Williams waiting with a cardboard box filled with groceries. Real food, not the expired items I'd expected. Peanut butter, bread, canned vegetables, fresh apples, even a package of ground beef. This is from our congregation, he said simply. People who understand that circumstances can change faster than we can prepare for them. I don't know how to repay this, I said, my voice thick with unshed tears. You don't repay it, Pastor Williams replied. You receive it as grace, and someday, when you're in a position to help someone else, you pass it on. That's how God's economy works. Not through earning and deserving, but through giving and receiving. As I loaded the box into my car, I noticed a woman watching from across the parking lot. She was about my age, well-dressed, standing beside a BMW with a phone pressed to her ear. Something in her expression, a mixture of curiosity and disdain, made my cheeks burn with embarrassment. This was what my life had become, an object of pity for strangers. A cautionary tale whispered in church parking lots. The woman who'd lost everything because she'd been too trusting, too naive, too willing to believe in fairy tale endings. That night, as I prepared a simple meal from the donated groceries, I found myself questioning everything I'd believed about God's plan for my life. If this was his will, this poverty, this abandonment, this slow dissolution of everything I'd worked to build, then what kind of God was I serving? I knelt beside my bed as I had every night since childhood, clasping my hands in the familiar posture of prayer. But instead of the usual litany of gratitude and requests, only questions poured out. Why did you let me marry a man who would destroy me? Why did you allow me to waste 12 years loving someone who saw me as disposable? What was the point of all that sacrifice, all that service, all those years of trying to be the woman you wanted me to be? The questions hung in the darkness, unanswered and unanswerable. Outside my window, Phoenix glittered with lights from homes where families were gathering for dinner, where couples were sharing their days, where children were being tucked into beds with stories and prayers and promises of tomorrow. All of it felt impossibly distant from my reality. I climbed into bed clutching my mother's Bible, its familiar weight the only solid thing in a world that had become quicksand beneath my feet. The pages fell open to Job 13:15. Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. But hope felt like the cruelest joke of all. Am I being tested or just forgotten? The question echoed in my mind as sleep finally claimed me, carrying me into dreams where answers existed and love didn't come with expiration dates. In the morning, I would face another day of scanning groceries and forcing smiles, another evening of bills I couldn't pay, and a future I couldn't imagine. But tonight, wrapped in darkness and doubt, I held on to the faintest possibility that somewhere beyond my understanding, beyond my pain, beyond my circumstances, God was still God, even if he felt like a stranger. A week later, as if the universe had decided my suffering wasn't quite complete enough, an official-looking envelope appeared in my mailbox bearing the seal of the county court. The envelope felt heavy with legal authority, its contents dense with the kind of formal language that transformed human disasters into administrative procedures. Inside, documents printed on expensive paper informed me that I had 30 days to vacate the premises or face forced removal by law enforcement officials. The language was precise and impersonal, reducing my 12-year residence to a simple matter of property law and contractual obligations. Eviction. The word itself felt shameful, carrying connotations of failure and irresponsibility that I'd never associated with my own life. I'd always paid my bills, met my obligations, lived within my means, with the careful attention that people of limited resources learn to exercise as a matter of survival. Yet here I was, facing homelessness through no fault of my own. The final blow came that Monday morning, when I arrived at Parker's Market for what I assumed would be another routine day of scanning barcodes and forcing smiles. Instead, I found myself called into the manager's office, a cramped space behind the customer service counter that smelled of stale coffee and industrial disinfectant. Margaret Chen had been my supervisor for 8 years, a practical woman in her 50s who ran the store with quiet efficiency. She was fair, but never particularly warm, treating employees with professional courtesy that kept emotional attachments from complicating difficult decisions. "Sit down, Becky," Margaret said, gesturing to the metal folding chair positioned across from her desk. Her expression was carefully neutral, but something in her eyes suggested she dreaded what came next. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news," she continued without preamble. "We're downsizing. Corporate has decided to eliminate several full-time positions across all locations as part of a chain-wide cost reduction initiative. Since you've been here the longest, your severance package will be more substantial, but I'm afraid your position is being eliminated effective immediately." The words hit me like physical blows. 18 years of loyal service, of showing up early and staying late, of covering shifts for sick colleagues and working through holidays when other people were home with their families. All of it reduced to a corporate decision made by people who'd never learned my name. "Your final paycheck will include 2 weeks' severance pay," Margaret continued, sliding an envelope across the desk. "I want you to know this decision came from levels far above my authority. If it were up to me, you'd be the last person I'd consider letting go. 2 weeks' pay, $468 after taxes, barely enough to buy groceries for a month under normal circumstances, let alone enough to secure new housing and survive until I could find another job." I cleaned out my locker in the employee break room, gathering the few personal items I'd accumulated over nearly 2 decades. A photo of Ryan and me from happier times, a small succulent plant that had somehow survived under fluorescent lights, a coffee mug with a chipped handle that I'd grown fond of despite its imperfection. These meager possessions fit easily into a single plastic bag, a tangible representation of how little I'd allowed myself to accumulate in a workplace where I'd spent most of my adult life. The other employees avoided eye contact as I walked through the store for the last time, their discomfort palpable. I represented their own vulnerability, proof that loyalty and hard work offered no protection against the arbitrary cruelties of economic reality. They understood that acknowledging my situation too directly might somehow make them more susceptible to the same fate. Outside, the parking lot stretched before me like a desert of hot asphalt. My Honda Civic sat in the employee section where I'd parked it thousands of times before. Faithful and unpretentious, the only thing in my life that hadn't betrayed me when circumstances became difficult. I sat behind the wheel for a long time, staring at the store that had defined my identity for 18 years, wondering who I was supposed to be now that everything I'd thought permanent had proven ephemeral. The building looked the same: red brick facade, large windows displaying weekly specials, automatic doors opening and closing with mechanical regularity. But I was no longer part of that routine, no longer one of the people who made the system function. That evening, I called my sister Linda in Denver. We'd grown apart over the years, our conversations reduced to Christmas cards and brief Facebook exchanges. But she was the only family I had left. Surely blood meant something when everything else had fallen away. "Becky?" Linda's voice carried surprise and something else. Wariness, maybe, as if late-night calls from siblings could only bring bad news. "Is everything okay?" I tried to explain my situation with dignity, focusing on the facts without dwelling on the emotional devastation. Ryan had left. I'd lost my job. I was facing eviction. I needed temporary help, maybe a couch to sleep on for a few weeks while I got back on my feet. The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably long. "Oh, Becky," Linda finally said, and I could hear her calculating the inconvenience of my crisis. "This is really bad timing. Mark just started his new job, and we're still adjusting to the move. The kids are in their final semester, and everything's just complicated right now. Complicated. As if my homelessness was a scheduling conflict rather than a life-threatening emergency. I'm not asking for money, I said, hearing the desperation creep into my voice despite my efforts to maintain composure. Just somewhere to stay until I can find work. I could help with the kids, do housework, whatever you need. It's not that simple, Linda continued, her tone growing more defensive. Mark's company is conservative, and appearances matter. Having someone in your situation staying with us might send the wrong message about our stability. Someone in your situation. Not her sister, not family. Someone whose failure might contaminate their success. Besides, she added, as if delivering a killing blow disguised as concern, don't you think this might be a wake-up call? Maybe God is trying to tell you something about the choices you've made. I mean, you always were too trusting, too willing to let people take advantage of you. The words cut deeper than any physical wound. Here was my own sister, the person who'd grown up in the same house with the same values, suggesting that my suffering was somehow deserved, that my circumstances reflected moral failings rather than betrayal by someone I'd trusted. I have to go, I whispered, unable to bear another moment of her judgment disguised as wisdom. Becky, wait, she began. But I'd already hung up. The next morning brought another phone call, this one from Ryan's mother, Eleanor. I'd maintained a relationship with her even after Ryan's complaints about his family had grown more frequent and cutting. She was a devout Catholic who attended daily mass and volunteered at the parish food bank, and I'd always felt she understood the importance of service and sacrifice in ways her son had never appreciated. "Rebecca, dear," she said, her voice carrying the refined accent of someone who'd grown up in Boston society. "I heard about your situation. I'm so sorry things didn't work out between you and Ryan. Didn't work out. As if our marriage had been a casual arrangement that simply lost its appeal rather than a sacred covenant broken by deliberate betrayal. I know this must be difficult," she continued, "but perhaps it's for the best. Ryan needs someone who can match his ambitions, someone who can help him reach his full potential. You're a lovely girl, but you two were never really suited for each other." A lovely girl. At 41, after 12 years of marriage and 18 years of faithful service to her son, I was still just a girl. Sweet, simple, inadequate for the sophisticated life Ryan deserved. "I hope you understand," Eleanor added, "that I can't take sides in this matter. Ryan is my son, and I have to support his happiness. But I do wish you the very best in whatever comes next. Support his happiness. Not seek truth, not demand accountability, not even acknowledge the cruelty of abandoning a wife via voicemail. Just support his happiness, as if that was the only consideration that mattered. But the most devastating call came from someone I'd never expected, my former coworker Sarah, who'd left Parker's Market 6 months earlier to work at a dental office. She'd heard about my situation through the workplace gossip network and wanted to reach out. "Becky," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I can't believe what Ryan did to you. After everything you sacrificed for that man, everything you gave up to support his career, it's evil." Finally, someone who saw the situation clearly, who understood the magnitude of what had been done to me. I felt tears of relief starting to form. "But," Sarah continued, and I felt my heart sink at that single word, "I have to ask, didn't you see the signs? I mean, looking back, there must have been red flags. The way he talked about you sometimes, the way he acted when you weren't around." "What do you mean?" I asked, though part of me already knew I didn't want to hear the answer. "At the company Christmas party 2 years ago, when you went to the bathroom, he was telling Mark from accounting about how he felt stuck, how he'd married too young, before he really knew what he wanted, how sometimes he looked at the wives of his colleagues and wondered what his life would be like if he'd made different choices." The words hit me like a series of physical blows. While I'd been at home wrapping presents and preparing for our celebration, Ryan had been at his office party discussing our marriage like a mistake he regretted making. While I'd been choosing his tie and making sure his suit was pressed, he'd been confiding in strangers about his dissatisfaction with the life we'd built together. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, recognizing the impact of her revelation. "I thought you should know. I thought maybe it would help you understand that this isn't about your worth as a person. This is about his character, his selfishness. But maybe you're better off without him. Better off. Homeless, jobless, abandoned by family, facing eviction, but better off because at least now I knew the truth about what my husband really thought of me." That night, I knelt beside my bed and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Every familiar phrase felt empty. Every verse I'd memorized seemed to mock my circumstances. How do you trust in God's plan when that plan seems designed to destroy everything you've ever loved? How do you maintain faith when the people who should love you most treat you like an inconvenience to be managed rather than a human being deserving of dignity? "Lord," I finally whispered, "I don't understand what you're doing. I've tried to be faithful, tried to be the woman you wanted me to be. I've served others. I've forgiven. I've sacrificed. And this is what I get? Abandonment? Betrayal? Family members who see my suffering as entertainment or moral instruction?" The silence that followed felt heavier than any answer could have been. I opened my Bible to the book of Job, searching for someone who'd suffered innocently, someone who'd maintained faith despite incomprehensible loss. But even Job had friends who sat with him in his misery, even if they eventually offered terrible advice. Even Job had a community, people who acknowledged his pain even if they couldn't understand it. I had no one. My husband had discarded me. My family had abandoned me. My friends had revealed themselves to be gossips and judges rather than sources of comfort. Even my coworkers had avoided me in my final days, treating my circumstances like a contagious disease they might catch through association. Would Jesus forgive this too? I asked the empty room. Should I forgive again? How many times am I supposed to turn the other cheek before I'm allowed to acknowledge that I'm being destroyed? But somewhere in the depths of my despair, a small voice whispered a different question. What if this isn't about forgiveness at all? What if this is about finally learning to value yourself the way God values you? The thought was so foreign, so contrary to everything I'd been taught about Christian womanhood, that it felt almost blasphemous. But it also felt like the first honest thing I'd thought in years. Maybe, just maybe, God wasn't asking me to endure abuse in the name of love. Maybe he was asking me to recognize that I deserved better than the scraps of affection and respect I'd been accepting for so long. The idea terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. What would it mean to stop enabling other people's selfishness? What would it look like to set boundaries, to say no, to choose my own well-being over others' comfort? For the first time since Ryan's voicemail had shattered my world, I felt something other than despair. I felt the dangerous stirring of hope. The car became my refuge when the eviction notice expired, and the sheriff's deputies arrived to oversee my removal from the house I'd called home for over a decade. They were professional but firm, explaining with practiced sympathy that I could take only what I could carry, and that any remaining possessions would be disposed of according to state law. I packed what fit in my Honda with desperate efficiency, choosing between items that all seemed essential until forced scarcity demanded impossible decisions. Some clothes, a few books that had provided comfort during difficult times, the photo albums Ryan had deemed unworthy of theft. Everything else, the dishes my grandmother had given me, the furniture I'd saved months to buy, the accumulated artifacts of a life lived in one place for over a decade, became someone else's problem to solve. That first night in the car, parked behind a 24-hour laundromat where security lights provided safety and the constant hum of industrial washers masked the sound of my crying, I discovered depths of despair I hadn't known existed. The back seat wasn't designed for human habitation, and my body couldn't find any position that didn't result in cramped muscles and aching joints. But something extraordinary happened on the third night of sleeping in my car. I woke before dawn, stiff and cold, but strangely alert, and found myself reaching for my Bible, not out of desperation, but out of genuine hunger for God's word. The pages fell open to Exodus 14:14. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Be still. Not passive, not accepting of abuse, but still enough to hear God's voice above the chaos of my circumstances. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace that had nothing to do with my external situation and everything to do with a quiet certainty that I was exactly where God needed me to be. That morning, I made my first concrete decision in years, a choice based on my own needs rather than someone else's comfort. I drove to the Salvation Army shelter on Van Buren Street, swallowed my pride, and asked for help. The intake worker was a woman named Carmen, probably in her 30s, with kind eyes and the unhurried manner of someone who'd heard every variation of human disaster. She didn't ask probing questions about how I'd ended up homeless, didn't make me justify my circumstances or prove my worthiness for assistance. "You just need a safe place to sleep and some time to get back on your feet," she said, handing me a clipboard with forms to complete. "That's what we're here for. No judgment, no strings attached, just help when you need it." The shelter dormitory was basic: rows of single beds separated by thin curtains, shared bathroom facilities, and a common area where residents could watch television or read donated books. But it was clean, safe, and filled with women who understood that pride was a luxury none of us could afford. My bunkmate was a woman named Maria, probably in her 50s, who'd been laid off from her job as a hotel housekeeper when the pandemic hit. She'd lost her apartment, her savings, everything, but she greeted each day with remarkable optimism. "God hasn't forgotten us," she told me that first evening as we prepared for sleep. "Sometimes He has to strip everything away so we can see what we're really made of. Sometimes the wilderness is where He does His best work." The wilderness. I'd never thought of my circumstances in biblical terms, but Maria's words resonated with something deep inside me. The Israelites had wandered for 40 years before reaching the Promised Land. Jesus had spent 40 days in the desert before beginning His ministry. Maybe this wasn't punishment. Maybe it was preparation. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in over a decade. I made a decision without considering how it would affect anyone else. I walked to the public library, sat down at a computer, and began researching bankruptcy laws and divorce procedures. For the first time in my adult life, I was going to protect my own interests instead of assuming that God required me to sacrifice them for others' benefit. The legal aid office downtown was bustling with people in circumstances similar to mine, folks who'd been blindsided by life's cruelties and needed help navigating systems designed to favor those with resources and connections. I waited 3 hours to see an attorney, but when my turn finally came, I met someone who would change the entire trajectory of my situation. Jennifer Martinez was a young lawyer, probably in her early 30s, who specialized in cases involving financial abuse within marriages. She listened to my story with the focused attention of someone who'd heard similar tales too many times to be shocked, but not so many times that she'd become callous to the human cost. "Mrs. Morrison," she said when I'd finished explaining my circumstances, "what your husband did constitutes financial abuse. Stopping mortgage payments without your knowledge, draining joint accounts, abandoning you with debts you had no hand in creating. These are deliberate acts designed to leave you vulnerable and dependent. Financial abuse. I'd never heard the term before, but it perfectly described what had happened to me. This wasn't just a marriage gone wrong. It was a calculated campaign to destroy my financial stability and force me into desperation. We can file for divorce immediately," Jennifer continued, "and seek emergency spousal support while the case is pending. We can also pursue asset recovery. If he emptied joint accounts, we can trace where that money went and demand its return." For the first time since Ryan's voicemail, I felt something resembling hope. There were laws to protect people like me, systems in place to prevent one spouse from destroying the other's life with impunity. I wasn't helpless. I just hadn't known what options were available. "There's something else," Jennifer added, consulting her notes. "Given that your name is on the house deed and you contributed to the down payment, you have equity rights that can't be dissolved without proper legal process. He can't just kick you out and sell the house without giving you your fair share? My fair share." The phrase felt revolutionary after years of accepting whatever scraps of consideration Ryan chose to offer. I had rights, legal protections, claims to assets I'd helped build even if my contributions had been minimized or dismissed. That afternoon, I called Grace Chen, the widow from church who'd pressed her phone number into my hand weeks earlier. When I explained my situation, she didn't hesitate. "You come stay with me," she said in her direct way. "I have extra room, and I could use the company. My Harold's been gone 2 years now, and this house gets too quiet sometimes." Grace lived in a modest ranch-style home in an older neighborhood near the church, surrounded by mature trees and well-tended gardens. Her guest room was small but comfortable, with a single bed covered in a handmade quilt and a window that looked out onto her backyard where she grew vegetables and flowers. "You stay as long as you need," she told me as I unpacked my few possessions. "No rush, no pressure, just heal and figure out what comes next." That evening, Grace made dinner for both of us. Simple food prepared with care and served with genuine warmth. As we ate, she told me about her marriage to Harold, 43 years of partnership built on mutual respect and shared faith. "Harold always said that marriage should make both people bigger, not smaller," she reflected, refilling my water glass. "If one person is getting smaller so the other can feel bigger, that's not marriage. That's something else entirely. Getting smaller." That perfectly described what had happened to me over 12 years with Ryan. A gradual diminishing of my dreams, my voice, my sense of worth, all in service of his expanding ego and ambitions. "I think," Grace continued, "that God sometimes allows us to lose everything we thought we needed so we can discover what we actually need. And sometimes what we need most is to remember our own value." That night, for the first time in months, I slept deeply and dreamlessly. When I woke the next morning, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: curiosity about what the day might bring. Instead of dread, instead of the familiar anxiety about how to please others or avoid their disappointment, I felt genuine interest in my own life and my own choices. I made coffee in Grace's kitchen, read my Bible on her back porch while morning light filtered through the trees, and planned my day according to my own priorities rather than someone else's expectations. It was a revelation. This simple act of living for myself instead of constantly calculating how my actions would affect others. When Jennifer Martinez called that afternoon with an update on my case, she had news that made my heart race with possibilities I'd never dared imagine. "We've located the assets from your joint accounts," she said, her voice carrying barely contained excitement. "Ryan moved the money to a personal account, but because it was community property, we can recover it. We're talking about approximately $43,000 plus interest and penalties. $43,000. More money than I'd ever had access to at one time. Enough to start over completely, enough to make choices based on what I wanted rather than what I could afford." "There's more," Jennifer continued. "The house appraisal came back, and your equity share is worth approximately $67,000. Combined with the recovered assets and spousal support, you're looking at financial security for the first time in your adult life." I sat in Grace's living room, holding the phone with trembling hands, trying to process what I was hearing. After months of believing I was destined for permanent poverty, I was learning that I actually had resources, significant resources, that had been hidden from me through Ryan's deliberate deception. "Mrs. Morrison?" Jennifer's voice brought me back to the present. "Are you still there?" "Yes," I whispered, then cleared my throat and spoke more firmly. "Yes, I'm here. I can't believe this is real." "It's real," she assured me. "And it's just the beginning. Tomorrow we file the divorce papers, and we demand full financial disclosure. Your husband is about to learn that abandoning a spouse isn't as simple as he thought it would be." That evening, Grace and I sat on her front porch, watching the sunset paint the Arizona sky in shades of orange and purple. I told her about Jennifer's call, about the money and the house, and the possibility of a future I could choose for myself. "You know what this means?" Grace asked, her eyes twinkling with something that might have been mischief. "What?" "It means God was never finished with your story. He was just editing out the parts that didn't serve his purposes." I laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in months. Not the polite chuckle I'd perfected for social situations, but genuine, from-the-belly laughter that came from joy rather than politeness. "I need to tell you something," I said when the laughter subsided. "For the first time in my life, I'm excited about tomorrow. Not because I know what's going to happen, but because I finally get to decide what happens." Grace reached over and squeezed my hand. "That's what freedom looks like, dear. That's what it means to be a daughter of the king instead of a slave to other people's expectations. As I prepared for bed that night, I knelt beside the guest room bed and offered a prayer that was different from any I'd ever spoken before. Instead of asking God to fix my circumstances or change other people's hearts, I thanked Him for showing me my own strength, for revealing resources I hadn't known existed, for giving me the courage to choose dignity over familiarity. Lord, I whispered, I don't know what comes next, but for the first time in years, I'm not afraid of tomorrow. Thank you for loving me enough to show me that I deserve better than what I was accepting. Help me to keep choosing your truth over other people's lies about my worth. The peace that followed that prayer was different from anything I'd experienced before. Not the fragile calm that comes from avoiding conflict, but the solid tranquility that comes from knowing you're finally walking in alignment with God's will for your life. I was no longer the woman who would accept crumbs and call them blessings. I was becoming someone new, someone who understood that loving others didn't require destroying yourself, that forgiveness didn't mean enabling abuse, that God's plan for my life included dignity, security, and joy. The transformation had begun. 3 weeks after Jennifer Martinez filed the divorce papers, Ryan finally made contact. Not through his lawyer, not through a formal legal response, but through a text message sent at 2:47 a.m., a time when desperation often overrides pride and careful calculation. We need to talk. This doesn't have to get ugly. Meet me at Denny's on Camelback Road tomorrow at 7 p.m. Come alone. I stared at the message, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something else I couldn't immediately identify. Then I realized what it was. Power. For the first time in our relationship, Ryan needed something from me. He was the one asking for a meeting, setting terms, hoping for cooperation. The balance had shifted, and we both knew it. I showed the message to Grace over breakfast, watching her face carefully for any sign that she thought I should comply with his request. Instead, she shook her head decisively. Honey, if he wanted to have a civilized conversation, he would have done it months ago instead of leaving you a voicemail and disappearing. This isn't about talking. This is about manipulation. He's realized his plan isn't working, and now he wants to negotiate. But something in me knew I needed to face him, not because I owed him anything, but because I needed to see with my own eyes the man I'd wasted 12 years loving. I needed to speak my truth to his face, not for his benefit, but for mine. I'm going, I told Grace. But I'm not going alone, and I'm not going unprepared. I called Jennifer Martinez, who insisted on being present for any conversation with Ryan. Financial abuse cases often involve intimidation tactics, she explained. Having legal representation present protects you and ensures that anything he says can be used appropriately in court. When I arrived at Denny's that evening, Ryan was already there, sitting in a corner booth with his back to the wall, a position that gave him a clear view of the entrance and maximum control over the environment. He looked older than I remembered, his hair showing gray at the temples and his face bearing the stress lines of someone who'd been living with the consequences of his choices. But what struck me most was how small he seemed. This man who'd loomed so large in my life, whose approval I'd sought so desperately, whose criticism had shaped my self-image for over a decade, he was just a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, trying to manage a situation that had spiraled beyond his control. Jennifer arrived a few minutes later, her presence immediately shifting the dynamic. She was younger than both of us, but her confidence and legal authority filled the space in a way that made Ryan visibly uncomfortable. He'd been prepared to manipulate me. He hadn't been prepared to negotiate with a lawyer who understood exactly what he'd done. Mr. Morrison, Jennifer said, sliding into the booth beside me, I assume you're here to discuss your response to the divorce filing and the asset recovery demands? Ryan's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. I'm here to talk to my wife about resolving this situation without destroying both our lives. Ex-wife, I corrected, my voice steadier than I'd expected. You made that choice when you abandoned me via voicemail. He flinched at the word abandoned, as if I'd struck him with something more devastating than truth. Becky, please. I know I handled things poorly, but we don't have to make this into some kind of war. We can work something out that's fair to both of us. Fair to both of us. The audacity of those words after everything he'd done, the secret planning, the financial manipulation, the calculated cruelty of his departure, made my chest burn with righteous anger. Fair would have been an honest conversation before you started planning your exit, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. Fair would have been not draining our joint accounts without telling me. Fair would have been not leaving me homeless and jobless while you started your new life. I was going to take care of you, Ryan said, his tone taking on the patronizing quality I'd grown to hate. I had a plan to make sure you were okay, but you had to involve lawyers and turn this into a legal battle. Jennifer leaned forward, her voice cutting through his attempted manipulation with clinical precision. Mr. Morrison, taking care of someone doesn't involve financial abuse, abandonment, or leaving them with debts they can't pay. Your client has suffered significant damages as a result of your actions. My client, Ryan repeated, his mask of civility finally slipping. Becky, how can you let some stranger speak for you? We're married. We can work this out between ourselves. We're not married, I said, each word deliberate and clear. You ended our marriage when you decided I wasn't good enough for your future. You don't get to play the husband card now that you need something from me. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Ryan's eyes darted between Jennifer and me, calculating his next move, searching for some angle that might restore his advantage. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different tone. Harder, more threatening. You're making a mistake, Becky. You think you can take half of everything I've worked for? You think some legal aid lawyer is going to help you destroy me? I built my career, my reputation, my assets. You contributed nothing but domestic labor. That domestic labor, Jennifer interjected, enabled your career advancement. Your wife's unpaid contributions to your household, her financial contributions to your home purchase, her sacrifices that allowed you to pursue professional opportunities, all of that creates legal claims to marital assets. Ryan's facade cracked completely. She's a grocery store clerk. She doesn't deserve half of what I've built. The words hung in the air like a physical assault. After 12 years of marriage, this was how he saw me. Not as a partner, not as someone who'd supported his dreams and sacrificed her own, but as a grocery store clerk who didn't deserve consideration. But instead of the crushing shame I'd felt for so many years when he'd dismissed my worth, I felt something entirely different. Clarity. Crystal clear, undeniable clarity about who this man really was and what our marriage had actually been. You're right, I said, my voice calm but carrying steel underneath. I am a grocery store clerk. I worked 18 years scanning barcodes and serving customers with dignity and respect. I earned every dollar I made through honest labor, and I used those dollars to support our life together. You're a financial advisor who committed financial abuse against his own wife. Which one of us should be ashamed? Ryan's face flushed red, but before he could respond, Jennifer placed a folder on the table between us. Mr. Morrison, these are the financial records we've compiled. Bank statements, asset transfers, credit card charges, mortgage payment histories. We have a complete picture of how you systematically drained marital assets while planning your departure. If you want to avoid criminal charges for financial abuse, I suggest you consider our settlement offer very carefully. She opened the folder, revealing pages of documentation that laid bare the scope of Ryan's deception. Bank transfers made in the middle of the night, automatic payments canceled without authorization, credit card purchases for items that had never appeared in our shared home. You bought her jewelry, I said, staring at a credit card statement that showed a charge for over $3,000 at a jewelry store. While I was rationing groceries and wondering why our savings were disappearing, you were buying jewelry for another woman. Ryan's silence was answer enough. Who is she? I asked, though I realized I didn't actually care about the answer. Whoever she was welcome to him. Never mind. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you planned this betrayal for months while I was still trying to save our marriage. Becky, no. The word came out with such finality that it surprised all of us. You don't get to explain or justify or manipulate anymore. You made your choice. Now you live with the consequences. I stood up from the booth, Jennifer following my lead. My lawyer will be in touch about the settlement. You have 30 days to respond to our offer, or we proceed to court where all of this becomes public record. Wait, Ryan said, panic creeping into his voice. My reputation, my career. If this goes public, It could destroy everything. I paused at the edge of the table, looking down at this man who'd once seemed so powerful, so essential to my happiness. You should have thought about that before you decided to destroy everything I'd built with you. I forgive you, I continued, my voice steady and clear. I forgive you for the lies, the manipulation, the financial abuse, the abandonment. I forgive you for treating me like I was disposable, for making me feel worthless, for wasting 12 years of my life on someone who was incapable of real love. Ryan's face showed confusion, as if forgiveness was the last thing he'd expected to hear. But forgiving you doesn't mean I'm going to enable your behavior anymore, I added. It doesn't mean I'm going to protect you from the consequences of your choices. It doesn't mean I'm going to pretend that what you did was acceptable or that I deserved it. I turned to leave, then looked back one more time. You said you were going to find something better than me. I hope you do, because I've already found something better than you. I found myself. Outside in the parking lot, Jennifer put a hand on my shoulder. That was incredibly brave, Mrs. Morrison. I've seen women in your situation cave under that kind of pressure. Agree to settlements that leave them with nothing just to avoid conflict. You stood your ground. But I wasn't thinking about bravery or legal strategy. I was thinking about the woman I'd been when I'd walked into that restaurant. Nervous, uncertain, still carrying some small hope that Ryan might acknowledge what he'd done and ask for forgiveness. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and refused to accept less than she deserved. The next morning, my phone rang with a call from Linda, my sister in Denver. Word had apparently traveled through family networks that I was pursuing a divorce and asset recovery, and she was calling to express her disapproval. "Becky, I heard about what you're doing to Ryan," she said without preamble. "This is so unlike you. You were always the one who could forgive anything, who put family first. Now you're acting like some kind of victim, trying to destroy a man's career over a marriage that just didn't work out." "A marriage that just didn't work out," I repeated, marveling at how people could minimize abuse when acknowledging it required them to take sides or offer support. "Linda, he abandoned me via voicemail after draining our joint accounts and stopping mortgage payments without telling me. I was facing homelessness because of his deliberate actions." "Well, maybe if you'd been more supportive of his career, if you'd worked harder to meet his needs, things might have turned out differently," she said, her voice carrying the judgment that had characterized our relationship for years. "Marriage is about compromise, Becky. You can't just demand everything when things get difficult." I felt something shift inside me, the same clarity I'd experienced with Ryan, but deeper and more permanent. This wasn't about Ryan anymore. This was about a pattern of relationships where my needs were always secondary, where my pain was always minimized, where my worth was always questioned. "Linda," I said, my voice carrying a finality she'd never heard before. "I'm done compromising myself into nothing. I'm done accepting crumbs and calling them blessings. I'm done letting people treat me poorly and then blame me for not being grateful enough. You're being selfish." "Yes," I interrupted. "For the first time in my life, I'm being selfish. I'm choosing my own well-being over other people's comfort. I'm protecting myself instead of protecting people who've hurt me. And you know what? It feels like the most Christian thing I've ever done." The silence that followed was pregnant with implications. We both understood that something fundamental had changed, that the old dynamic between us was over. "I love you, Linda," I continued, "but I won't let you treat me like my pain doesn't matter. If you want a relationship with me, it has to be based on respect, not on me accepting whatever scraps of consideration you choose to offer." "Fine," she said, her voice cold. "If that's how you want it to be, that's how it has to be," I replied, and hung up the phone. Standing in Grace's kitchen, holding the phone that had just severed another toxic relationship, I felt something I'd never experienced before. The peace that comes from choosing truth over comfort, dignity over familiarity, God's voice over human manipulation. I was learning that sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for yourself and for others, is to stop enabling their worst impulses. Sometimes forgiveness means setting boundaries. Sometimes following Jesus means walking away from people who can't love you the way he does. For the first time in my life, I felt truly free. 2 months after the confrontation with Ryan, Jennifer Martinez called with news that would change everything. The settlement had been finalized, and the numbers were even better than we'd hoped. Between the recovered assets, my share of the house equity, and the spousal support agreement, I was looking at enough money to completely rebuild my life. Not just survive, but thrive. $112,000, Jennifer said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a job well done, plus ongoing spousal support for 18 months while you get back on your feet. Mrs. Morrison, you're financially independent for the first time in your adult life. I sat in Grace's living room, holding the phone with trembling hands, trying to process what true financial freedom might feel like. For 41 years, I'd lived paycheck to paycheck, carefully calculating every purchase, stretching every dollar until it screamed. Now, for the first time ever, I could make choices based on what I wanted rather than what I could afford. But more important than the money was what it represented. Validation that my contributions to the marriage had value, that my sacrifices had meaning, that I deserved security and dignity rather than the scraps Ryan had been willing to throw my way. There's something else, Jennifer continued. Ryan's employer was very interested in avoiding any public disclosure of his financial misconduct. They've indicated that if you're willing to sign a non-disclosure agreement, they'd be prepared to add a substantial settlement to encourage your discretion. An additional $50,000 in exchange for my silence about what Ryan had done. The offer was tempting, life-changing money that would set me up for years to come. But something in my spirit recoiled at the idea of helping Ryan escape the consequences of his actions. I need to think about it, I told Jennifer. Pray about it. I'll call you tomorrow. That evening, Grace and I sat on her back porch as the sun set over her garden, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. I told her about the settlement, about the NDA offer, about the choice I had to make between financial security and speaking truth. What does your heart tell you? Grace asked, her weathered hands folded in her lap as she watched the last light fade from the sky. That taking their money to stay quiet would make me complicit in his behavior, I said without hesitation. That other women deserve to know what kind of man they're dealing with, that sometimes telling the truth is more important than protecting yourself. Grace nodded slowly. Harold used to say that integrity isn't what you do when people are watching. It's what you do when no one will ever know the difference. But in this case, you'll know, and God will know. The next morning, I called Jennifer and declined the NDA offer. I won't take money to protect a man who financially abused his wife, I told her. If his employer wants to keep him, that's their decision to make with full knowledge of who they're employing. Are you sure? Jennifer asked. That's a significant amount of money to walk away from. I'm sure, I said. And for the first time in months, I felt completely at peace with the decision. Some things are worth more than money. With the settlement funds in my account, I began the process of rebuilding my life from the ground up. But instead of rushing into major decisions, I did something I'd never done before. I took time to figure out what I actually wanted rather than what others expected of me. I started with small things. I bought new clothes. Not the practical discount store items I'd worn for years, but clothing that made me feel confident and attractive. I got my hair cut and styled by a professional for the first time in a decade. I bought books I'd always wanted to read, took myself to restaurants I'd never been able to afford, went to movies in the middle of the day just because I could. Each small act of self-care felt revolutionary, like reclaiming pieces of myself that had been lost in years of putting everyone else's needs first. I was learning to be selfish in the best possible way, choosing my own happiness, honoring my own desires, treating myself with the kindness I'd always shown others. But the most significant change came when I decided to pursue the dream I'd abandoned years earlier, opening my own business. With my settlement money and 18 years of retail experience, I had both the resources and the knowledge to create something meaningful. I found a small storefront in an older neighborhood near Grace's house, a space that had previously housed a gift shop but had been empty for months. The rent was reasonable, the location had good foot traffic, and something about the space felt right the moment I walked through the door. Second chances, I would call it. A combination thrift store, bookshop, and coffee counter where people could find quality items at affordable prices while enjoying a sense of community and connection. It would be a place where everyone was welcome, where dignity wasn't determined by income level, where stories mattered more than status. I threw myself into the planning with energy I hadn't felt in years. I researched suppliers, designed the layout, created a business plan that balanced profitability with social mission. For the first time since high school, I was using my brain for something more challenging than scanning barcodes and making change. The physical work of preparing the space was therapeutic in ways I hadn't expected. Painting walls, arranging furniture, organizing inventory. Each task was a concrete step toward creating something that belonged entirely to me. No one could take this away. No one could dismiss its value. No one could claim credit for my vision and effort. Grace became my unofficial business partner, helping with everything from choosing paint colors to pricing donated items. Her presence made the work feel less like labor and more like play. Two women building something beautiful together. "You know what I love about this place?" Grace said one afternoon as we arranged books on newly installed shelves. "It's going to be a place where people's stories matter more than their bank accounts, where someone can find exactly what they need, even if they didn't know they were looking for it." 3 weeks before the planned opening, I received an unexpected visitor. Pastor Williams knocked on the store's front door while I was inside arranging the coffee counter, his familiar smile visible through the glass. "I heard through the church grapevine that you were opening a business," he said when I let him in. "I wanted to see for myself and offer our congregation support." He walked through the space slowly, taking in every detail: the comfortable reading nooks, the carefully curated merchandise, the community bulletin board where people could post job openings and service requests. When he reached the small corner I'd designated as a quiet space, complete with a few chairs and a basket of devotional books, his eyes lit up. "This is beautiful, Becky. Really beautiful. It's not just a store, it's a ministry." "I hadn't thought of it that way," I said, though something in my heart recognized the truth of his words. I just wanted to create a place where people felt valued, where they could find what they needed without judgment. "That's exactly what ministry looks like," Pastor Williams replied. "Creating spaces where people experience dignity and grace, where they matter simply because they exist." He paused near the front window, where I'd hung a simple sign: "Everyone has a story worth telling. Everyone deserves a second chance." "You know," he said, "I've been watching your journey these past months. The way you've handled everything. The betrayal, the financial abuse, the family rejection. It's been remarkable. You've shown what it looks like to forgive without enabling, to love without losing yourself." His words brought tears to my eyes, not from sadness but from recognition. This was who I'd been becoming. Not the doormat I'd been for so many years, but a woman who understood that loving others required first learning to love herself. "There's something I want to ask you," Pastor Williams continued. "Our church has been looking for someone to lead a support group for women going through difficult life transitions, divorce, job loss, family estrangement. Women who need to hear that their stories matter, that they have value beyond their circumstances. Would you consider it?" The request took me by surprise, but even as he spoke, I felt something stirring in my chest, a sense of purpose that went beyond personal healing to helping others find their own paths to wholeness. "I don't have any formal training," I said, though I was already imagining what such a group might look like. "I'm just someone who survived her own mess." "That's exactly what qualifies you," Pastor Williams replied. "Not theology degrees or counseling certificates, but lived experience. The kind of wisdom that comes from walking through fire and coming out stronger on the other side." The night before Second Chances opened, I knelt beside my bed in Grace's guest room and offered a prayer unlike any I'd ever spoken. Instead of asking God to fix my circumstances or change other people's hearts, I thanked Him for the journey that had brought me to this moment. "Lord," I whispered, "a year ago I thought my life was over. I thought the best I could hope for was to survive the destruction of everything I'd built. But you had other plans. You used my deepest pain to show me my greatest strength. You used my husband's betrayal to reveal my own worth. You used my family's rejection to teach me about unconditional love." I paused, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the transformation I'd experienced. "I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but I know it will be mine to choose. Help me to use this freedom wisely, to build something that honors you and serves others. Help me to never forget that my value comes from you, not from other people's opinions or approval. The prayer felt different from any I'd offered before. Not desperate or pleading, but grateful and confident. This was what it meant to trust God not just with your circumstances, but with your purpose, your calling, your contribution to His kingdom. Opening day of Second Chances exceeded every expectation I'd dared to have. The store filled with customers from the neighborhood, members of our church, and strangers who'd seen the simple advertisement I'd placed in the local paper. But more than the sales or the foot traffic, what moved me most was the conversations. People sharing their stories, connecting with others, finding exactly what they needed in ways that went far beyond merchandise. An elderly man bought a cookbook and told me about learning to cook after his wife's death. A young mother found children's books and shared her struggle to provide educational materials on a tight budget. A teenager discovered a leather jacket that made her feel confident enough to interview for her first job. Each transaction felt sacred, not because of the money exchanged, but because of the human dignity honored in every interaction. This was what I'd been created for. Not to diminish myself in service of others' egos, but to create spaces where everyone could experience their own worth and potential. As the day wound down and the last customers left, Grace and I sat in the quiet store, surrounded by evidence of dreams realized and purposes fulfilled. The cash register showed healthy sales, but more importantly, the guest book I'd placed near the entrance was filled with messages of gratitude and encouragement. "You did it," Grace said, her voice filled with pride. "You built something beautiful from the ashes of what looked like complete destruction." "We did it," I corrected, taking her hand. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, without Pastor Williams, without Jennifer. God used so many people to help me find my way." But even as I spoke, I knew that the real miracle wasn't the support I'd received. It was the discovery of strength I'd never known I possessed. The woman who'd crumbled at a voicemail 8 months earlier was gone, replaced by someone who understood that her value wasn't negotiable, her dreams weren't secondary, her happiness wasn't contingent on other people's approval. That night, as I locked up Second Chances and headed home to Grace's house, I caught my reflection in the store window. The woman looking back at me was someone I barely recognized. Confident, purposeful, at peace with herself and her choices. She looked like someone who'd found her calling, someone who understood her worth, someone who'd learned to trust God's plan even when it looked nothing like what she'd expected. She looked like someone who'd finally come home to herself. 1 year after opening Second Chances, I stood in my thriving store on a quiet Tuesday morning, watching the sunlight stream through the front windows and illuminate the space I'd built from nothing but determination and faith. The shelves were full of carefully curated items, the coffee corner buzzed with regular customers who'd become friends, and the community bulletin board overflowed with success stories. Job offers accepted, apartments found, new friendships formed. But the transformation that mattered most wasn't visible in my store's success or my financial stability. It lived in the peace that had settled into my bones, the quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who I was and whose I was, regardless of what anyone else thought or said. The support group Pastor Williams had asked me to lead had grown from 3 nervous women meeting in the church basement to over 20 women gathering twice a week, sharing stories of betrayal and abandonment, discovering their own strength and worth through honest conversation and prayer. We called ourselves Daughters of the King, women learning to claim their royal identity instead of accepting the peasant treatment they'd endured for too long. "Each of you," I told the group during our Monday evening meeting, "has survived something that was designed to destroy you. You're still here, still breathing, still capable of joy and love and purpose. That's not coincidence. That's divine intervention." The faces around me reflected every stage of the journey I'd traveled. Sarah, recently divorced after 25 years of marriage, still raw with anger and disbelief. Margaret, whose adult children had cut her off financially and emotionally after years of taking advantage of her generosity. Linda, not my sister, but another Linda, who'd lost her job at 62 and been told by family members that she should be grateful for whatever scraps of work she could find. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. Things are going well now, but what if they change their minds? What if I end up alone again? I recognized the fear in her voice because I'd lived with it for months. The terror that freedom was temporary, that independence was an illusion, that any moment the ground would shift beneath my feet and I'd be back where I started. Margaret, I said gently, that fear is understandable, but it's not from God. Perfect love casts out fear, remember. You're not responsible for other people's choices, but you are responsible for your own. Every day you choose to honor yourself, to set boundaries, to speak truth in love. Those are choices no one can take away from you. After the meeting, as I was putting away chairs and cleaning up the coffee cups, Sarah approached me with tears in her eyes. "Becky," she said, "6 months ago I was sleeping in my car, just like you did. Tonight I signed a lease on my own apartment. It's small, it's not fancy, but it's mine. I wanted you to know that watching your journey gave me hope that mine was possible too. These moments, witnessing other women discover their own strength, their own worth, their own capacity for joy, filled me with a sense of purpose I'd never experienced during all those years of serving others at my own expense. This was different. This was mutual, reciprocal, life-giving rather than life-draining. The first support group meeting I'd ever led flashed through my memory. I'd been terrified, certain I was unqualified to guide anyone else through their pain when I was still healing from my own. But Pastor Williams had placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "God doesn't call the equipped, Becky. He equips the called." Now, a year later, I understood what he'd meant. My suffering hadn't been meaningless. It had been preparation. Every moment of despair, every instance of betrayal, every night spent crying in my car had been building something inside me that could only be forged through fire. Compassion that went beyond sympathy. Wisdom that came from lived experience. Faith that had been tested and proven real. 3 months after that first support group meeting, I'd received a call that still made me smile whenever I remembered it. Grace had answered the phone while I was restocking shelves, and I'd heard her voice change from polite greeting to genuine surprise. "Becky," she'd called, holding the phone with her hand over the mouthpiece. "It's your sister Linda. She wants to talk to you." My first instinct had been to refuse the call. Linda had made her position clear during our last conversation. She thought I was being selfish, vindictive, unchristian in my refusal to enable Ryan's behavior or accept my family's judgment. But something in Grace's expression suggested this call might be different. "Linda?" I'd said, taking the phone with careful neutrality. "Becky, She'd paused, and I could hear something in her voice I'd never heard before. Uncertainty, maybe even humility. "I owe you an apology. A big one." She'd gone on to explain that Mark, her husband, had been having an affair for over a year. She'd discovered it the same way I'd discovered Ryan's betrayal, through careless evidence left where it couldn't be ignored. But unlike my situation, Mark had admitted his infidelity and begged for another chance. "I kept thinking about what you said," Linda continued, her voice thick with tears. "About not accepting crumbs and calling them blessings. About choosing your own well-being over other people's comfort. I realized I've been doing exactly what you used to do, making myself smaller so someone else could feel bigger." The conversation had lasted 2 hours, with Linda asking detailed questions about how I'd found the courage to leave, how I'd survived the financial uncertainty, how I'd dealt with family members who tried to make me feel guilty for protecting myself. "I'm not sure I'm strong enough to do what you did," she'd admitted near the end of our call. "You are," I'd assured her. "You're stronger than you know, and you don't have to do it alone." That conversation had led to weekly phone calls, then a visit from Linda and her children, then her decision to separate from Mark and file for divorce. Watching my sister discover her own strength, seeing her children witness their mother choosing dignity over dysfunction, had been one of the most healing experiences of my entire journey. Now, as I locked up second chances on this peaceful Tuesday evening, I thought about the ripple effects of choosing truth over comfort, boundaries over enabling, faith over fear. My decision to stand up for myself hadn't just changed my life, it had given permission to other women to examine their own circumstances, their own relationships, their own choices. Walking home to the small house I'd purchased 6 months earlier, my first home that belonged entirely to me, I marveled at how different the streets looked when you walked them as a free woman rather than a prisoner of your own low expectations. The same Phoenix neighborhoods that had once felt like a maze of limitations now felt like a landscape of possibilities. My house was nothing fancy. A modest two-bedroom ranch with a small backyard where I'd planted a garden that reminded me of Grace's. But it was mine, paid for with money I'd earned through my own courage and determination. No one could take it away. No one could threaten me with homelessness. No one could use shelter as a weapon against my autonomy. That evening, I sat on my back porch with a cup of tea and my mother's Bible, watching the sunset paint the Arizona sky in shades of gold and purple. The pages fell open to Jeremiah 29:11, a verse I'd read countless times but never understood until now. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you, to give you hope and a future. For most of my life, I'd interpreted that verse as a promise that God would make everything easy, that faith was a shield against hardship and suffering. Now I understood it differently. God's plans for prosperity weren't about avoiding pain. They were about using pain to reveal strength I didn't know I possessed. His plans for hope weren't about circumstances always working out. They were about discovering that my joy didn't depend on circumstances at all. The future he'd promised hadn't looked anything like what I'd expected. I'd thought it would involve growing old with Ryan, watching grandchildren play in our backyard, celebrating anniversaries and retirement, and all the milestones that traditional marriages were supposed to include. Instead, it involved discovering my own worth, building something meaningful from scratch, helping other women find their voices and their courage. His plan had been better than mine all along. I just hadn't been ready to see it. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah, the woman from support group who'd signed the lease on her apartment. Just wanted you to know, I got the job. The one at the nonprofit that helps women starting over. They said my life experience made me the perfect candidate. Thank you for showing me that our scars can become our qualifications. I smiled, thinking about how many times over the past year I'd received similar messages. Women finding jobs, leaving toxic relationships, reconciling with estranged children, starting businesses, going back to school, discovering talents they'd forgotten they possessed. Each story was unique, but they all shared the same theme: women learning that their lives belonged to them, that their happiness mattered, that God's love for them wasn't conditional on their willingness to accept mistreatment. As the last light faded from the sky, I thought about Ryan and wondered briefly what his life looked like now. According to Jennifer Martinez, he'd married the woman he'd been buying jewelry for while still married to me. I hoped she was happy, hoped he'd learned to treat her better than he'd treated me, hoped they'd both found whatever they'd been looking for. But mostly I didn't think about him at all anymore. He'd become a character in a story about the woman I used to be, not the woman I'd become. His opinion of me had lost all power the moment I'd learned to see myself through God's eyes instead of his. Standing up to go inside, I caught my reflection in the sliding glass door. The woman looking back at me was someone I was still getting to know. Confident without arrogance, kind without being a doormat, strong without being hard. She looked like someone who'd learned the difference between selflessness and self-destruction, between forgiveness and enabling, between love and fear. She looked like someone who'd finally come home to herself. Before going to bed, I knelt beside my bed as I had every night since childhood, but my prayer was different now, not desperate pleas for other people to change, but grateful acknowledgement of how much I had changed. "Thank you, Lord," I whispered, "for loving me enough to let my world fall apart so I could build it back better. Thank you for every person who rejected me, because their rejection led me to your acceptance. Thank you for every door that closed, because it forced me to find the door you'd opened. Thank you for showing me that I am fearfully and wonderfully made, that I have purpose and value that no one can take away." As I settled into sleep in my own bed, in my own house, surrounded by the peace that comes from living in alignment with God's will for your life, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me here. Not just the destination, but the entire path. The pain that had revealed my strength. The betrayal that had shown me my worth. The abandonment that had taught me to find my identity in God rather than in other people's approval. Have you ever experienced something similar in your own life, or known someone who has found the strength to choose their own dignity over other people's comfort. How did faith help you or them through that transformation? If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel so this message can reach someone who needs to hear it today. Sometimes we need to be reminded that God's plan for our lives includes joy, dignity, and purpose, not just endurance. May God bless everyone who's been through something like this, everyone who's still finding their courage, everyone who's learning that they deserve better than they've been accepting. In Jesus' name, amen.